Reading 136 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 3. Great Animal House, September 4th, 1948. Further notes on self-observation. Observation of depression in centers. Work idea. Man is not one, but a multiplicity. He has not one mind, but several minds. He has not one eye, but very many eyes. Commentary. In order to get to know themselves, a man, a woman, must observe themselves. Without self-observation, there can be no self-knowledge. People, of course, imagine they know themselves and live in this illusion. It is precisely this illusion that prevents them from realizing that they do not know themselves and that in place of self-knowledge, they have imaginary pictures of themselves which do not resemble themselves as they really are, and which only complicate their lives with pretenses and lead them in 101 wrong directions. Nursing these pictures of themselves, as it were, like precious dolls, they rarely catch even a glimpse of themselves, and if they do, they hug their dolls more closely. In saying all this, I am not exaggerating. This is what Gurdjieff taught, and after many years in the work, I know its truth. We live with the most ridiculous ideas of ourselves, and as a result, we cannot change, cannot grow, and so cannot understand anything new. Everyone stands before a mirror most of the day. Have you noticed this? But it is not a mirror, really. A real mirror distorts nothing and reflects without criticism exactly what is before it. It is this mirror that we need, a real objective mirror, and not an imaginary one. But how many could survive having their imaginary mirror, whether self-flattering or self-pitying or self-debasing, taken away and replaced by a true one? Would we not all go mad when we saw everything in us exactly as it is? A man must penetrate very far into himself before he could bear such an experience. His consciousness of what is in him would have to be vastly enlarged. His self-knowledge would have to be deep and genuine, based on long, uncritical self-observation. And then, of course, if this were the case, his whole idea and sense and feeling of himself would have changed, so much so that he might already be in sight of real I, which is our own true goal, and he might even catch a glimpse of the Master behind real I. Let us clearly grasp that there can be no approach to real I if one is stuffed with illusions, lies, and pretenses about oneself. Now, as regards self-observation, people do not follow what the work teaches. Take, for instance, depression. People in the work say, just as people in life say, I feel depressed, and think they have observed themselves. Well, they have not. They have not begun to observe themselves. If you wish to observe what you may unthinkingly call depression, you have to observe from where it arises. From what part of the machine is it coming? From which center? For instance, it may be coming from the intellectual center. You will say, how can depression originate in the intellectual center? Surely depression must always arise from the emotional center. Well, if you say that, you certainly have not observed yourself. The emotional center may be quite cheerful, and yet you are aware of depression existing somewhere in you. Now, if you cannot get used to the idea that you are not one single, unvarying person, but a multiplicity of eyes, and so of contradictions, you will never understand. One part of oneself may be cheerful and another part depressed. How, you will say, can such a thing happen? I am either cheerful or depressed. In that case, you think of I as one thing, and so all along your career in the work, you will make the most elementary blunders, both in understanding yourself and in understanding the work, because you cannot see or acknowledge that you are not one but many. A loss of prestige is certainly involved here. Noble fellow. Yes, but I fear that this noble fellow is a picture. Perfect honesty and virtue. Yes, but I fear that this perfect honesty and virtue is a picture. Utter integrity. Yes, but I fear the same thing again. So seeing through your own bluff, as it were, you seize stalking about full of nobleness, honesty, virtue, and integrity. Actually, we are quite different from our pictures, and indeed far more interesting. Yes, we do steal jam still. Yes, we do lie, and so on. Yet, and is it not strange, you can watch people becoming old and dried up because they still nurse their dead dolls, still cling to what is not themselves, and so lose all possible contact with the essential springs of their real existence. In such a case, the personality has conquered, particularly with the aid of the false personality. You can see a great many people in this situation every day if your mental eyes are opened to the inner state and level of others. It is especially interesting to watch when a person stops and pitches camp for good in this long, strange, psychological journey called the work. They meet a small difficulty and halt and settle down. There are some interesting parables about this, and it is all because of these false pictures of themselves that they worship and cling to. Now, one source of depression is obviously these pictures. So, in observing the origin of depression, you must observe whether it comes from a picture that has been injured by some chance remark. Of course, you will not be able to observe the picture directly, because it is imaginary. But you will be able to observe the remark, and from that, after perhaps many years, gradually deduce the picture that dominates you and prevents you from escaping from its narrow, jealous power. I remind you here of what was said recently about touchiness and noticing what makes you touchy, a very useful and practical form of self-observation. Now to return to observing depression. As was said, it can originate from different centers. It may, for example, be due to instinctive center borrowing force owing to a slight infection. It may arise from the intellectual center, and certainly often does, in the case of women, perhaps more than with men, but I do not know. Intellectual depression is a very well-marked form of depression and is not primarily due to the emotional center. The worst depression possible originates in the emotional center itself. Only here again are many forms involving different parts of the emotional center. Depression centered in the moving part of the emotional center is common enough and is merely a kind of boredom. Depression arising from the emotional part of the emotional center tends to violence. Depression arising from the intellectual part of emotional center is dangerous because it is connected with the loss of faith in God, taking God here as the source that gives us our daily bread, our daily supply of meaning for our existences. Then there is the depression that comes from people giving up some of their usual interests and sources of meaning from some wrong aim. To give up a source of meaning without having another to take its place is to tamper ignorantly with the balance of the machine. Remember, we are taught in the work that the first conscious shock can be given safely. It does not tamper with the machine. Reflect here on all that the first conscious shock means. Then again, there is the depression that comes from allowing old stereotyped eyes to criticize work eyes, the old criticizing the young in oneself, which is an ancient theme in myths, as Kronos or Time eating his children. All that has been said is to show how wide self-observation must become, and how silly it is to say, for instance, I am depressed, and leave it like that. One at least can begin by asking oneself, what I is depressed? But in this paper, which is more about centers, I cannot go into this aspect of self-observation dealing with eyes. Suffice to say that eyes live in every part and subdivision of the different minds or centers in our machines. But I will add that we may be haunted by an evil eye that seeks to drag everything down into despair and meaninglessness. Well, watch and observe this evil eye continually.